Okay, welcome to Inside Soccer episode 2. So this week we're going to delve into the world of mental health within football academy. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce my next guest on Inside Soccer, and that's Dr. Tom Buck. How are you doing, Tom? Are you okay?
Yeah, I am good, thank you, Al. Yeah, are you all right? Yeah,
Yeah, not too bad, Tom. Not too. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
yeah,
Obviously respect your journey and your work that you're doing in this space, which is fantastic. And like I say, we'll get into that as we go. So just to kick off, really, TV, just a little bit of an overview, if that's okay, in relation to
yeah.
your journey so far, your background, your interest in football, and obviously your PhD stuff. If you can give us a little bit of detail, that'd be brilliant to kick off with.
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of those people. I think like we typically tend to come across them, don't we? Where you've always been involved in sport, like you've always loved it, and then it's one of those things like as you're getting a bit older, getting to like 16, 17, you're like, oh, I'm probably not good enough to like be a professional athlete. But I'm just genuinely passionate about sport, so you find a way to work in it, and then I sort of, yeah, I suppose when I was about 18, like 17, 18, I was just like really interested in psychology and sport psychology. And I was like, well, like these players and athletes are getting so much fitter and faster and like physically unbelievable. And I sort of had this thought of, well, what's going on between their ears? Like what's making the difference there? So that sort of kicked off a passion for sports psychology, really, and then sort of took me through university, through a master's, and then eventually got to my PhD, and I was deciding, like something I really wanted to do. I've always wanted to do, and just felt like how do I marry up this passion of sport into this really strong interest which has developed into that passion around like mental health in sport, because obviously you see all these stories emerging, and it sort of paints a picture, but it doesn't necessarily tell you why, like what's the reason, like why are athletes struggling with mental health issues. And obviously we don't want to sort of generalize and say every single athlete struggles with a mental health issue, but I was just really interested in the potential influences or the potential, I suppose, factors that were associated with why an athlete would be more likely, as the data would suggest, more likely to develop a mental health issue within a professional sporting organisation. So that was the sort of rationale for the PhD, really. And then that developed and evolved as PhDs do, when you have discussions and you have those conversations with your supervisors and then like fellow professionals and fellow academics and stuff, where you then start to think and change things. And then it then developed into essentially like attitudes towards help seeking. So sort of looking at athletes' views around how they engage with support services within high performance cultures. So looking at mental health stigmatization within high performance sport, how does that impact like rational versus irrational beliefs, and then how likely are they to engage with support services, and looking at those key factors where athletes are struggling, and they're clearly struggling to some capacity, and then how is that engaged with by both the organisation as well as the player, as well as the professional support services that are available. And then alongside that, a very long-winded answer to this, alongside that, just developing my own applied work, really. And then I've been in and out, as you know, in and out of applied work for like last 10 years, really, and then sort of different priorities of sort of taken focus here and there, which has meant I've had to sort of put it to one side. But I've really engaged with it more actively in the last 18 months, 2 years, where I was started to be more active working with players on a one-to-one basis from first team level to academies. So I've had really good experience, like been quite lucky in terms of working for like Premier League teams, Championship teams, League One, League Two teams, from an academy level to first team level on just a one-to-one basis, as well as being part of like a multidisciplinary team. So been lucky in that sense, and also working in other sports has been really interesting. Sort of like looking at the similarities and differences in terms of like high performance sports, specifically like Premier League football, for instance. It's such a high pressure environment that the expectations for performances are, it's indescribable. Like, obviously, as you know, like we've had many discussions around the pressures and the expectations that are put on academy players, for instance, to get into first teams, by themselves, as well as parents, coaches, etc. But there's a huge amount of pressure and expectation on these young players, and then even more so at the first team level. How are they able to cope with those demands, and what does that mean for their well-being, outside the sport as well as inside the sport? So, like starting to marry up my PhD with that applied work in terms of balancing the well-being and the performance focus has been really worthwhile, and I'm really enjoying that. I get a lot of satisfaction out of it, sort of like working with these players, and you see how they develop, and you see how much they're willing to invest in working on themselves, both personally and professionally. I think that's the most rewarding thing for me, is that I've had conversations with players and they come away from the service, for instance, and they go, like I just generally feel better. Like I've got better strategies to deal with stresses, for instance, and that helps me play better. But also I've found it helps me in my day-to-day life as well, which, as I say, I find incredibly rewarding when you have that kind of conversation. So, yeah, very long-winded answer, but that's yeah. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, yeah, great. No, it's interesting to hear you, Jake, because I know he's quite a decent footballer as well. So I've seen you in action a couple of times. I think that little bit of pedigree that you have there I think it always helps when you go into the applied work. So what we'll do, Tom, is for the benefit of kind of this session, this podcast, we'll venture into the academy, if that's okay, as opposed to talking about like under 21 players or first team players. So when I've kind of watched some of your presentations and some of the stuff that you've done over the last year or two, especially in like the player care space or the sports psychology space, you mentioned this sort of difference between mental health and mental illness, and you also mentioned that I found was quite interesting is like flourishing and languishing as well. So can you just give us a little bit of an overview of what's the difference, Tom, between somebody's mental health and somebody having a mental illness?
Yeah, so I mean, mental health anyway is a broad term for like basically being, as you are physically well, you are psychologically well. Is that like the World Health Organization definition around it is around sort of being high psychological well-being. Essentially, you're able to flourish in a day-to-day environment, you're able to socialize, you're able to exercise, you're able to engage with things in a meaningful and purposeful way, and you're able to adapt to different situations and difficult circumstances. So mental health is a broad term that essentially encompasses one's psychological function, like your emotional state, your thought processes. And then that, if that does begin to languish, as you said, for a prolonged period of time where one might start to experience depressive symptoms, or might be in high stress situations, might have anxiety related issues, it can start to deteriorate into worse areas, like, for instance, the individuals that particularly struggle with addiction, for instance, or they might have sort of like personality disorders. It becomes really significant in terms of requiring clinical intervention, potentially medication, therapeutic services, etc. So that's the really low ebbs of the continuum, whereby someone unfortunately is in a languishing psychological state for a prolonged period of time, where they then become eligible for a clinical mental illness diagnosis. So that's the real difference. And I've become like a bit of a stickler, I suppose, for language, because I think a lot of the sort of general consensus, if you're sort of watching television, for instance, they sort of talk about mental health as a negative. So it's like, oh, like your mental health is struggling, for instance. And I was like, I understand that, but then also we're talking about someone who's potentially just having like a series of bad days, or they've got a prolonged low mood state, which, you know, can happen. You can have things can happen in life which unfortunately will make you feel sad, it'll make you feel upset, and it might impact your willingness to want to exercise and to want to engage with others, for instance. But for me, and the clinical diagnosis is a prolonged state in that sense, whereby someone has been struggling for a long time and requires intervention, either medication or therapeutic services or otherwise. Essentially, a clinical professional has to step into that. So for me, I think it's like it's it's getting better, I think, in terms of like the discussion, because I do think when you sort of tune into like different television programs, for instance, or the way people talk about it now, it sounds like people understand more. Whereas I'd say, like, you know, a couple of years ago, 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, even the sort of discussions around mental health were basically largely negative. So if you mentioned mental health to someone, that immediately was associated with a mental illness. But there's a very clear differentiation between those two terms in relation to everyone has mental health. It can flourish and languish in equal measure depending on who you are as an individual, your worldviews, your experiences, your environments, your capacity to engage with stresses, for instance, can influence whether or not you then develop a stress related disorder. Like if you don't have the strategies, or your brain is wired differently to someone else, it might impact your ability to actually engage with certain situations. In that sense, you may then be diagnosed with a stress disorder, and it might require intervention. So it's not to say like it always has to have negative connotations, but I do think it's important that we clarify that differentiation of mental health is a broader term of day-to-day functioning, as is your psychological health. For instance, if you feel, sorry, your physical health, if you feel physically well, then you tend to feel a bit more confident. You tend to feel a bit more happier. The same with your psychological health. If you feel happier, you tend to feel a bit physically better. They sort of the reciprocal, like they impact each other. And the research tells us that a lot in terms of those who suffer high stress are more likely then to experience physical symptoms. So I think, yeah, we have to be clear in terms of mental health as a broader term, almost like an umbrella for everything that falls underneath that on a day-to-day basis. But mental illness is a clinically diagnosable issue which requires intervention to some capacity, depending on the severity.
You touched on there, Tom, about the sort of the differences over the sort of the generations, that you know we are getting better. It is a slow process at times, and I sort of go back into sort of my playing days many years ago, where I don't think mental health was ever mentioned, or sports psychology, whereas you know these days we're kind of more understanding. There's more knowledge there. There's more appropriate support. So I'd just like, next question, Tom, I'd just like to get your views on is like, within football academies, what do you think the current status of the mental health support is? Is it adequate? Is it very good? Is it brilliant? You know, how would you appraise that, Tom? What's your thoughts on that?
It depends entirely on the level. It depends entirely on the funding. Depends the category of the academy. I think if you were asking me that question specifically about Cat 1 academies who have a huge amount of funding, the likes of City, Liverpool, United, for instance, who have huge multidisciplinary teams and incredible amounts of support from both physical and psychological perspectives. If you were to isolate that question to that, I would answer and say, yeah, it's fantastic. You know, there's loads available. It's really well developed. Obviously, depending on the club's culture, depending on the club's philosophies, there are sometimes the emphasis is weighted slightly differently. But I think one of the major benefits of like the EPPP, for instance, is that those Cat 1 academies are they are mandated to have that support. They have to have that psychological support. They have to be able to educate players and be able to support them from both a physical and psychological perspective. So in that sense, it's really robust. How well adapted the clinical focus is up for debate in that sense. Like even at the highest level, I think referral systems aren't quite up to standard. I can't generalize because it's difficult to say in terms of how different clubs would approach the examples that you've suggested then. But I think from a broader perspective, great at the Cat 1 level. I think unfortunately what then happens is it sort of, I've got to choose my words carefully because I don't want to say deteriorate, but it comes down to it comes down to less accessibility, I would say. So it's not necessarily that it deteriorates, but because of funding, because of staffing, that access to available support becomes more restricted as you then start to drop down the pyramid, but then also start to drop down the categories within the academy. So, for instance, the Cat 3 Academy, as part of the EPPP, for instance, they have to have some psychological support, but there's no definition as to who has to provide that. So theoretically, anyone within a Cat 3 Academy could provide, a handful of workshops over the course of a season. How effective it is depends on the individual providing it, but it might mean nothing. Again, you might just have someone who doesn't have a lot of time on their hands. They're incredibly busy in a Cat 3 Academy, and they're being asked to deliver some psychological workshop within that environment, and they sort of have to go, oh, right, okay, I might have to go and Google some stuff, or I might have to find some examples, or, if you have got the budget for it, bring in a guest speaker or something, or bring in a professional. So there's some capacity there. But at Cat 3, yeah, some psych support required, but who delivers that is then up for debate, which is part of a wider issue then in terms of, well, who's qualified or who's at the right level to be able to deliver that effectively and support those players. And then obviously you've got Cat 2, which sort of sits in the middle there, where the requirement is more robust, therefore the support is more robust, because it becomes more of a definition of this support is required, so it has to be provided by someone who is appropriately qualified to deliver said support. So, I mean, it's a difficult answer to your question, because I'd love to say across the board it's fantastic, but it depends entirely on funding, and I think it creates almost like a classism. That's my concern, is that at Cat 1 academies you've got huge amounts of funding, huge amounts of support and staffing, etc., and players are able to engage in that as and when they need to. Cat 3, more restrictive, less access, less staffing. Players who may need that support may not even know where to get it, may have to then independently seek it out. They may have to finance it themselves. And that, again, creates an issue. Like a lot of footballers, for instance, come from working class backgrounds. They might not be in a position where they can pay that amount of money to get that support. On average, you're probably talking anywhere between £60 and £100 for like single sessions, depending on who you go to. So it's very, very difficult. But it's for me, it's the funding issue. It's the disparity between what's available at the top to what then cascades down to League Two, for example, whereby dependent entirely on the club's access to funding. So obviously, if you've got a huge amount of funding and you're pushing for promotion and you're pushing to enhance the club, like Wrexham's a great example. They've had a huge amount of investments and they've come from non-league and are now in the Championship, and they've, like in the last 12 months, have now got a Cat 3 academy, and they're investing hugely into their academy development. So you look at that and you think, well, realistically, they're looking to progress and develop their own academy structure. So it's not necessarily ridiculous to suggest that they probably will then increase their category to a Cat 2 status in the next 2 years, 2-3 years, for instance. It's not a ridiculous statement to suggest that, because they're investing in it and they've got the finances to do so. But then you look at a League Two side who potentially have got a Cat 3 academy and they've got no investment, and they're saying, well, we have to have a sports scientist, but they're part-time because we can't afford to pay them full-time. We might have a data analysis or a performance analyst, and again, they're sort of part-time because we can't afford to have them. What's the value or what's the importance? Well, we need to make sure they fit. We need to make sure they're looked after. And we need to make sure that we manage any injuries effectively because we need to maintain. So that's essentially what we're doing. We're just trying to function. So the priority for sports psychological support or like mental health support, for instance, falls by the wayside because it's important that we just sort of look after the players physically at this point. And the people I've talked to, by the way, they'd all love to have that. Like, there's no one saying we don't want sports psychological support. We don't want to provide these players with every possible level of support within this system. But again, I'm repeating myself here, but it just comes down to finances and accessibility. And unfortunately, the gap is widening and widening in that where we've seen academies closing in the last couple of years, like academies who've been around for decades just no longer functioning because it's not sustainable, it's not financially viable for the clubs, and it's a great shame in that sense. And unfortunately, I think sports psychology, it falls down the pecking order of importance when you don't have access to that funding, which again probably speaks volumes of the perceptions of the level of support is that we value physical support over psychological support, which I get because it's a physical game and you've got to make sure you look after your players physically, but also, again, to reiterate what I said at the very start here, they're under huge amounts of pressure. Like they've got to perform, they've got to engage, they've got to manage that stress, they've got to understand it. And you're talking about young people who are anywhere between sort of 11, 12 years old up to 17, 18. They might just not have the necessary tools or strategies to be able to deal with that. And then that gets carried home and that creates a new pressure, that creates a new stress, which then adds on to the previous one and it snowballs over time. And unfortunately, that's where you then see players really struggling when they inevitably end up having to exit these academies. There's no support in-house. That's not available. That means there's no support upon exit, which then means I'm left to fend for myself. But I've spent the best part of 5-6 years fighting for a spot, and all the while my emotional state is fluctuating all the time because I just don't have the strategies. So as I said, I can't generalize that, but I've unfortunately you're coming across it frequently.
Great points, Tom. I'd just like to sort of expand upon some of the points you made there in relation to something that we've spoke quite a bit about, and that is athletic identity, forming that almost that exclusive, let's use the word football identity, because young players now, academies, you can go into an academy under nines, train a few times a week officially, play on a weekend, but we know that there's pre-development stuff now. There's young players getting scouted from sort of like 4 or 5 year old in sort of primary schools, and it's almost like it does make me shiver a little bit when you see some of these signing days when you get like 9-10 year old holding shirts up with their names on it. You see them kind of being treated as almost like a sort of a young professional in a way, and then before you know it, some of the parents or even the young person themselves have set up Instagram accounts with them scoring goals on there, and it does make me worry, stuff like that. So I'd just like to tap into your expertise, Tom, about high athletic identity and how that's kind of tied into self-worth, and how you would kind of recommend that a young player maybe could balance that. What would be your kind of advice from your background and your applied experiences?
Yeah, so I think one of those things, like the research is interesting around this, because I think like athletic identity, it's like a bit of a double-edged sword. So there's a sense whereby there's almost a requirement to have that really strong athletic identity to become successful. The problem there is that if it becomes too narrow, to the point whereby self-worth is then directly tied to the sport. As soon as then you're without the sport, you then start to really struggle from an existential perspective, where your meaning and your purpose as a human being is directly tied to that sport. A lot of the early research around it was on retirement. So we sort of looked at people who retired from sport and how that impacted their day-to-day life coming out of it. And there was fell off a cliff. So you'd see emotional states plummet to the point whereby they really struggled, experiencing depressive symptoms. Some of them sort of developing maladaptive coping strategies, picking up smoking, for instance, or engaging with alcohol or drugs, like not even necessarily just illicit drugs, but forming dependencies on prescription drugs like painkillers, suffered a long-term injury, and they end up sort of addicted to high strength painkillers. So a lot of the early research was around that. It's interesting, in more recent years, that's now started to be directed towards the developmental stages, and looking at the impact of players who are then released from academies. So unfortunately, we've seen several cases over the years whereby, players have been released and they've really struggled mentally. Some terribly sad stories where, unfortunately, players have taken their own lives as a result of leaving academies, which, by the way, isn't singular to football. There's stories that go sort of slightly under the radar where we've seen it in other sports as well. For instance, where they don't get selected for an Olympic team and then they really struggle in that sense. I remember reading a story a few years ago, unfortunately, that a young girl was a snowboarder and she wasn't selected for the GB Olympic team for the Winter Olympics, and she unfortunately took her own life. So that's how much it mattered to her. And then we've seen that in football, where it means so much to players that who they are as a person, as a human being, is so tightly bound to football that if they do not then have football, they face crises. They question who they are. They question their beliefs. They don't function well in the world around them. They find it difficult to find meaning in their day-to-day life. Like, essentially, their love and their passion, everything that they believe is good about the world, has been taken from them. So we see that, unfortunately, it happens at academies just as much as we saw it in retirement phases. Unfortunately, we see it in academy players as well. We also see it in injuries, for instance. So it's almost like players then get a taste of, well, if this is you without football, how do you cope with it? What's your life like without that opportunity to play? That's the danger, unfortunately. Is that, as you said then, is like players are being introduced into these systems at younger and younger ages, which, from my perspective, is ethically dubious at best anyway, because I think it's that whole idea of like creating robots, like the percentages are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller every year, and that's because the amount of individuals in the systems is completely oversaturated. So if you've got 6-7-year-olds, well, realistically, how many of those 7-year-olds are going to make it? Probably none.
Yeah.
But then if you isolated it to a group of 16 to 18-year-olds, how many of them are going to make it? 1, maybe 2, if they're lucky. So it's then it's extrapolated the population size. Like, there's huge amounts of populations in these systems now because they've got early development centres at professional clubs, which then become like filter systems for formalised academy structures. So when you go into like youth development phase, into professional development phase, like that's when it really matters. But then by that time, you've potentially spent the best part of 7, 8, 9, potentially even 10 years of your life in a system, in a club where you likely support that club, you're engaged, like you watch the first team play, you're familiar with the coaches, your parents come with you, there's a sense of structure, there's a sense of familiarity and routine. You get used to facilities, you get used to the access, you get used to the high quality pitches, for instance, as simple as that. Like what the surfaces that you're training on. It's like playing on Wembley.
Yeah.
Like you're training on the same level as you would playing in cup finals, for instance. So you become used to that level of high quality. And unfortunately, in some individuals, that then narrows their identity over time, where they tie their self-worth to that. So, for instance, if I'm a footballer and I have high confidence as a footballer, but then when I'm not playing football, I then begin to really struggle. I sort of lack the effective coping strategies. I don't understand who I am in the world around me. And that for me is a major danger for these young people who are in these systems for a long time, is being able to sort of broaden your perspective and widen your interests. So I understand you want to put a lot of effort into football. And if you want to be a professional footballer, it requires sacrifice. It requires your ability to understand and recognize these critical moments that you have to overcome those challenges. You have to engage with them meaningfully. And we can encourage players to do that. You know, like we've had discussions before, Al, like we don't want to make it all nice and neat and soft where players aren't challenged and they're not engaging with things that are difficult and they have to overcome adversity, because then otherwise the environments don't mean anything. You have to challenge them, because otherwise if they don't overcome it, that's probably testament to their ability to engage with that meaningfully. So it has to be challenging in some capacity. So don't disagree with that. But then also, are these environments or the people within these environments guilty of encouraging them to put their eggs in one basket, whereby I want you to just be this footballer because I think you've got the ability to do so. But then unfortunately, at 18 years old, when we no longer think you are good enough, because, you know, sort of Dave over here is unbelievable. Like, you know, we look at some of these young players like Rio and Gamoa for Liverpool and Max Dowling for Arsenal, like 15, 16, 17-year-olds playing for first teams in Champions Leagues and Premier League games. Tiny percentage of that population. It's like infinitesimal in comparison to what's actually in these systems. So you're talking about very unique circumstances where it just so happens two young people have broken into these systems with incredible talent. And it's incredibly commendable, like unbelievable attitude, technical ability, tactical awareness to be able to function in. You're playing against adults, you know. It's unbelievable. But then also the other side of that is then how can parents help them support it? And I think it is broadening their interest, is giving them opportunities to go, yeah, if you want to be a footballer, you have to make those sacrifices and you have to recognize that and engage with that. But also, as soon as you come away from that training environment, have the opportunity to decompress. I've had conversations before with players and it's like, oh, what are you doing outside of training? I'm going to go home and watch some clips and stuff. It's like, no, just go do something else. Just whatever it is. Like, you don't always have to watch football. You don't always have to engage with it. Give yourself. The best way I can describe this is if say, for instance, like you were an electrician and you worked from 8 a.m. till 8 p.m, and then you went home and then you started to rewire your house. Where's the time off? You've just spent the best part of 12 hours engaging with your profession, your career. And if it's something you're passionate about and you've worked hard around, amazing, really commendable. That's part of who you are, but it doesn't have to be all you are. That's my point, is that it can be a part of a much bigger rationale or purpose as to why you're on this planet. Because you're a human being at the end of the day. You know, you're not infallible. You're allowed to feel hurt. You're allowed to be frustrated. You're allowed to have these negative experiences and react to them in a positive, meaningful way. But also allow yourself the opportunity to become more than just one thing. It can be many parts. It doesn't have to be one part.
Brilliant points, Tom. So just a couple of pointers on the do you still think, Tom, because you've done a bit of work around academies over this last few years in relation to supporting young footballers as well as a little bit of work with pros as well. Is this, would you say there's still a stigma around mental health? I know we can argue it's getting better, and there's better support and there's better knowledge and understanding, and lots of different people now are exposing and writing in that space. But do you think there's still a sort of stigma in there about young footballers, especially opening up and speaking to you? Do you feel as though there's almost still an element of a little bit of almost, let's say, closed players who don't really want to ruffle any feathers or speak about anything? What's your thoughts on that, Tom, in relation to, cultural stigma and the young players? What stops them from opening up to you?
So I think the major thing that I've come across personally is that mental health literacy now, so like education awareness is fantastic. Like there's policies around it, there's clear like strategies around, well, how do we educate players? How do we sort of make them aware of, like, this is how you manage stress, for instance, this is how we can sort of view anxiety. What do you do if you feel like you're experiencing like depressive symptoms, for instance? This is who you can contact. So in terms of like awareness, like that, I feel like that's improved significantly in recent years, to the point now, like young players essentially go, oh, if you were struggling with a mental health issue, would you be confident in knowing who to contact? They'd probably go, yeah. The other question I would ask is then, would you be confident seeking out that support if you knew you were struggling with a mental health issue? I think there is still a stigma around help seeking. And the reason I would put that down to is selection, is that it's still very much viewed as a potential vulnerability. The same as you would like a physical injury. Like if I were to break my leg, for instance, that's going to impact my ability to play. So I'm not going to be able to play till that leg's better. I think there's still a strong view that if you were struggling with a mental health issue, that would then directly impact your ability to play. And in some instances, it might, if it is a significant clinical issue, that might impact you. And it probably will, depending on, as I said, the severity of that. So I completely understand that. But for me, there's a bunch of red flags that have been missed for someone to get to that point whereby they're really, really struggling, and that requires that significant intervention to the point of even, preventing loss of life, for instance. Like that's the sort of very bottom of the barrel issue. So that's the extreme version of that. However, you still sort of get players who are struggling with stress, like they still be struggling with anxiety, and like players who, they might even be having panic attacks, for instance. Like they're going home and they struggle with that, and they might be sort of experiencing anxiety disorders. It depends on how they're hardwired. Their brain just could be an anxious brain, and they've never developed the strategies to be able to allow them to function within a high stress situation. And it just so happens like they're very technically good and they're willing, determined players, and they put in effort, but then also the brains are going 100 million miles an hour, and they've got all these excessive negative thoughts that impact their self-worth and impact their confidence, but you never see that. So it's that whole sort of metaphor of a duck on still water. The duck looks fine, but the legs are going 100 miles an hour. And it's the same with these types of people where, I've come across these young lads who are experiencing very similar challenges related to stress and anxiety. And then you speak to them and it's like, well, how do you react to that, for instance? I don't know. So what are you doing when you've got all these negative thoughts? What do you mean? What am I doing? It's like, well, there's strategies we can talk about. There's things that we can do to help you with that. You don't have to have them, it's how we respond to them. And it's like, well, I never even thought about that. I never thought about it in that way. I didn't realize you could.
Yeah.
And then you go the other side of that coin, and it's like, yeah, I knew I've been struggling with stress, but I don't want to seek it out because I'm playing well.
Yeah.
And I know if this gets back to someone, is that going to impact my ability to be in the starting 11?
Yeah.
So to answer your question, I think there's the general stigma of talking about mental health has improved significantly to the point whereby I don't think that is as much of an issue. People are happy to talk about it. It becomes part of conversation. of like, oh, we know who to contact. We've got awareness. We've got understanding of symptomology, for instance. So we recognise it. And now players are getting better at recognizing it in themselves. Like, I know I'm stressed now.
Yeah.
And I didn't a while ago. So I know what that means to me personally. I know what stress is for me. I know what anxiety is for me. I know what that sort of low mood state feels like.
Yeah.
I don't know how to control that. I don't know how to turn that into something positive. I don't know how to sort of engage with that. Well, okay, that's part of the support service, and we can work on those things and allow you to engage meaningfully in that. And then, as I said, the other side of that coin is I recognise it, but I'm not going to seek support. Because if that gets back to someone and that impacts selection, listen, I'm 17 and I'm looking for a professional contract. There's not a chance in hell I'm jeopardising that for anything. So I will happily sit here with an anxiety disorder, with all these negative thoughts, which are exhausting, by the way. It's emotionally exhausting to carry that. And I'll go home and I'll sit there and I'll sit with all these negative thoughts that are just absolutely consuming me, knowing that they're happening with no controls and no understanding of how to turn that into something that actually helps me.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to seek support for that because I'm in the starting 11 and I'm playing well. I'm scoring goals and I'm keeping clean sheets or I'm making good decisions. So there's not a chance in hell I'm going to jeopardise that.
Yeah.
So that for me is a representation of stigmatization, because essentially what you're saying is that you know a mental health issue is present, but you're willingly avoiding support because you know that will impact your ability to play.
Yeah.
Which then, for me, speaks volumes about the culture of high performance sports. Because if someone expresses any sort of vulnerability, it's like, well, okay, I can take advantage of that. Because you've got to remember, there's not one right back in a team. There's not one centre midfielder. There's not one striker. There's not one goalkeeper. You've got a squad of players. So someone else is there. And if, you're playing alongside someone and you go like, well, I'm training and I'm in the starting 11 at the right back position. And I've got my mate over there who's training with me. And then I say to him, do you know what? I've been really struggling the last few weeks. I don't think like mentally I'm quite there. What's stopping him going and telling the coach, for instance? If he says, like he might be doing it from a good place, by the way. He might be going, I've been speaking to whoever, and he's told me he's struggling. I'm a bit concerned about him. Great.
Yeah.
Really encouraging behaviour. Well, then that coach goes, probably not a good idea to start him then, is it?
Yeah.
What if he makes a poor decision or something? Or what if he does something? But then you go into other environments potentially, and that coach might go, right, okay, but he has been playing really well, so there's probably a conversation to be had there. And it could be worth encouraging them to seek out the support. That's the really positive culture. But I don't see that consistently because it's ruthless.
Yeah, it is, Tom. It's such a weird culture, isn't it? Like football, especially academy football, because, like you say, you're almost like you're in a team situation, but you've got to look after yourself as well. Because if you don't play well, if you don't live up to expectation, there's always gonna be someone on your shoulder, isn't there? Like you say, Tom, putting a bit of pressure on you, and I think that's one of the things that saddens me the most about almost like the transition of grassroots players going into an academy is that the grassroots players probably absolutely love what they're doing. They're free. They can go and express themselves. They can truly find some joy in play, and then they go into the academy environment where you kind of scrutinised a little bit. The expectations are high. The demands are high. There's definitely pressure there, and you're just feeling that constant evaluation that you're having to undergo. And I always think that there must be so much hidden mental health challenges, issues within that journey, Tom, that it makes me quite sad in a way, because you're trying to get on, you're trying to do your best, you're trying to get to the top, as it were, because you want to be a professional footballer, but there must be so much difficult stuff around them as well that they're trying to juggle, especially at schooling and parents and keeping a sort of a life of normality, Tom, isn't it? What a word, normality. Keeping your feet on the ground and stuff like that. And because all your mates, you sort of like put on a pedestal, aren't you, in a way, if you're in a school situation and you get picked up by Man United or City or Chelsea or Liverpool, like all eyes are on you in a way, aren't you? Kind of. That must bring a lot of pressure to a young footballer going through a football academy.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's so many different components of that pressure. I think like absolutely spot on. I like completely agree with you, because unfortunately we end up in situations where parents then add to that. And unfortunately, that still happens, where you'll get parents who will be like, "Are they doing enough? Are you doing that?" It's like you pick them up from training. It's like, "I need you to have a look at this. We'll go and work on that now." And it's like, where's the break?
Yeah.
Where's, I'm pretty sure that person, this 13-year-old you're speaking to, is trying the best. And I'm pretty sure they want to come home to an environment that feels sort of comfortable and allows them to express any concerns or vulnerabilities. And then are you affording the opportunity for that? Again, we can't speculate, but unfortunately, you end up, I've ended up speaking to players in the past where it's just there's no off switch.
Yeah, they need to find something, Tom, don't they?
Yeah, it is. It's sad, Alan. I think part of the reason for that is because the top level is so lucrative.
Yeah.
It's a golden goose.
Yeah.
Like if you can get there, I said before about Rio and Gamoa and Max Dowman at Arsenal. It's like the opportunities for these young lads, like they're still on like scholar forms, by the way, so they're not eligible for professional contracts till they're 18. But my God, like the opportunities that come to you, knowing that realistically, if you maintain this now, we're probably going to guarantee you a professional contract.
Yeah.
So that conversation, I imagine, has already been had with these players, whereby we'll put you on these scholar terms. That's standard. We can't change that. That's legislative. We can't alter that. But what we can do is we can put an agreement together to say when that ends, we've been bumping you up. We're going to put you on a 5-year contract. You're going to be on this amount of money straight away, and you end up going from earning $2,000 to 50, 60K potentially.
Yeah.
It's life changing overnight, and that's what I mean. It's a golden goose. It's so lucrative, and so many of these young players, they come from working class backgrounds, and it's escape. It's an opportunity for an escape. It's an opportunity to change your family's life. That's an incredible amount of pressure to be putting on like 14, 15, 16-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
And I do genuinely believe that there's like just some people just psychologically are not made for professional sport.
Mm-hmm.
Like I know myself, like I was not psychologically designed to cope with the demands of professional sport.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine. Like I accept that. That's me as a human being. But then you also have to be able to accept that as a parent, as a coach, and sort of recognize that, yeah, you're amazing. And like you have had it yourself, Al, like we've heard stories over the years of like who's the best player you ever played with in an academy. And you'll hear the likes of Gary Neville say, "Oh, like it was this person," or like it was that person, and you're like, "Oh, I've never heard of them."
Mm-hmm.
It's like because they were unbelievable technically, they didn't have the right mindset or the right approach to be able to manage that effectively. And there's no shame in that, by the way.
Yeah.
But it's being able to get players to understand that is like, despite those circumstances, we have to accept what happens.
Yeah.
And statistically, you're probably not going to make it. So how are you going to maximize your opportunity? What are you going to learn from these challenging environments? What are you going to take from it? Because there's an incredible range of skills that you can take from being in these systems.
Mm-hmm.
And developing psychological behaviors. We talk about resilience, we talk about emotional regulation, leadership qualities, communication, determination, high confidence, all really valuable skills to take in your day-to-day life. So all right, if you're not going to make it, maximize the opportunity. How can you maintain connections? How can you develop those things? What are you interested in? Do you want to go into sports science, physiotherapy? Do you want to be a coach? do you want to be a sports psychologist?
Mhm.
Like, you can look at other things.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
that's the thing, is like how you then maximize that within being in these unbelievable environments. Take advantage of them.
Yeah, it's a great point, because I think sometimes academies get a bit of a raw deal. Like you tend to read quite a lot of negative stuff about them, but most of the teams on the, like you said earlier, they get to train on fantastic pitches, work with great
Yeah.
coaches. Chances are they're going to get a trip most years. They could go all over the world playing in competitions, and I think probably taking it day by day. I think that's probably the best advice I probably could give a young player.
Yeah.
Don't get too far into the future, if that makes sense. Just take it
Yeah.
day by day and just concentrate on that day and what you can do to make yourself better, instead of thinking, "Oh, I'm going to be a Premier League footballer now." And I think when parents especially and young players get like attached to an academy or get an opportunity, it's like the brains race 1,000 miles into the future. They're
Yeah.
already in the Premier League, aren't they, playing first team football, and let's deal with the here and now first.
That's exactly it, Alex. You can see it unfolding in front of you. Like, look at this opportunity. Like, this is what we could potentially get out of this. But again, I completely agree with you. I was like taking it day to day. One of my big things is maintaining that groundedness. Is like just being present in the moment. It's like I've got like an anxious brain. Like, I was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, and one of my whole things, like before I sought out support years ago. So it's funny. It's like, as a sports psychologist as well, it's like me then going seeking support from someone else because I needed someone to guide me to get those right tools and stuff. It's the same principle. Like, there's no shame in going out and seeking that support if it helps you. But one of my whole things is then just being present. Like, you're only ever in control of the moments.
Yeah.
What you did 5 seconds ago doesn't matter. What you did a second ago doesn't matter. Like, you can't change that.
Yeah.
The only thing that you can ever change and take advantage of is the present moment.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that whole thing of like, yeah, okay, we can plan for things, we can create strategies and stuff, and we might, like, there's plan A and there's plan B, and I can react to circumstances. But ultimately, thoughts, emotions, and behaviors is all you're ever in control of. So accepting that and turning that into something that's purposeful is again, it's one of my big things.
Yeah. Brilliant, Tom. Last couple of questions, Tom, for you. So I'm gonna ask you, from sort of a mental health kind of well qualified professional, if you could change one thing within football academies at the moment, what would you like to see, Tom? What would you like to do?
Yeah, I think one of the things particularly is like, well, the ideal situation is drawing back to my earlier comments around the disparity of support across the footballing pyramid is the big one. And I think that then sort of, I suppose, takes the power out of the club's hands and creates consistency of support throughout academy structures. But that is it's not feasible. I can't see that happening at all, because that would require clubs relinquishing control, for one, and two, would require a significant funding injection for an organisation to be able to finance that. So that's never going to happen. So that's sort of like pie in the sky stuff. The main thing that I do think is feasible is more structured or clearer referral pathways. Because one of the studies from my PhD, for instance, it was like an exploration of support services, and did interviews with professional support providers, mainly sports psychologists in environments, and sort of getting their views. And one of the things was essentially that they were relying on their own contacts for referrals. So it's like, yeah, we can go to the club doctor and then they might refer you, but then that might get bounced back to your GP. And it could be a sense of like, someone is basically in a position whereby they might be threatening to take their own life, and then we're having to fumble around trying to get an immediate referral. Whereas I think, like, if that was embedded in a system whereby someone could go, okay, we have like a clinical sports psychologist or a psychotherapist on the books, that we can go, right, you'll be in contact with them in the next hour. for instance. I think that would be amazing. Again, how feasible that is, I don't really know. But one thing that stands out to me is that I remember a conversation I was having a few years ago with someone. I won't mention the club, but basically they were like the lead sports psych at their academy, and they said this particular club had employed a clinical psychologist. And I was like, that's amazing. And he said, yeah, it's like their whole remit is around like mental health, like basically helping the players around like well-being, emotional support, etc. So it's like that focus. They were on a contract basis, so they'd come in maybe like twice a month, for instance, for like one-to-ones or like delivering workshops, and it was all around the sort of the mental health side essentially. 2020 went into lockdown. That was the first person that got let go.
Yeah.
And I was like, right, okay. And I was like, why do you think that is? And he said, because that was the lowest priority on the list of support where they knew they could cut funding. So it's like, yeah, if we had funding available and we were in great circumstances, fantastic. We'll get someone in, and that referral's immediately there. Also helps support the mental health side, providing workshops and delivery as well as one-to-ones. The pathway for a referral is literally point A to B. It's not point A to C, back to B, back to D, then back to A. No, it's literally one-to-one. We'll get you to see this person within the hour, essentially. And I was like, amazing. But then he said, as soon as he faced financial difficulties, who was the first person we can let go? It was the clinical psych. So I was like, well, what would you say that suggests? And it says, well, that's where they put their least amount of priorities towards, is that they effectively saying like mental health support is like the lowest priority within the academy.
I think as well, Tom. I think
shame.
It is, and I think another point as well. Like, there's so much turnover of players, isn't there? As well, like, I don't know how coaches, support staff in these academies like keep track of everybody like coming and going, and that's probably led me to going to lead us into our last question, Tom. About I've just been reading recently about the BPS are trying to promote more better support for aftercare and deselected players from academies. As we know, Tom, deselection can occur at any stage. You could be an under 11 or under 13 and under 16 and under 18 that unfortunately you might not get to that next stage or that next level. And I know the BPS are kind of trying to push around, try to do a little bit more for these younger players who do get deselected or released from clubs. So it's probably just to ask you that, Tom, really, as a last question. What do you feel could be decent in that space to do? Because deselection in aftercare is really important, isn't it? You mentioned earlier about players with real mental health difficulties after that. So what would be your thoughts on that, Tom?
Well, I think currently the initial concern is the fact that anyone who is employed as like a sports psych, for instance, within a club, like your remit around like player support, for instance, and developing players is isolated to that club. So as soon as they're deselected, they're no longer of any concern to you. So that's quite like an ethical / moral debate as a practitioner. Is like, well, we've got a duty of care because we want to look after these players, and also we know statistically they're likely to experience some sort of like low mood state or potentially depressive symptoms as a result of this, because it's expected. Because obviously it's a huge transition in their lives. Is that essentially we've told you you're no longer good enough, please exit the building. Huge amount of emotional, psychological impact on that individual. So essentially, the point I'm making there is that sports psychologist is then restricted to players within the club. So that means any possibility of aftercare is no longer feasible, because essentially what the club is saying is that we only care about players in the building. Now, I get that from like a business perspective. I get it from like even like a remit perspective, because what you're saying is like that's the priority, that's what we're paying you to do. So I get it. I get the premise, but then also I sort of, my issue there is like, surely do you not have a duty of care if you've invested a huge amount of time in these players and they've also given you a huge amount of time as players? Can there not be something even for the next like 3 to 6 months or at best like 12 months, for instance, where you just provide them the opportunity of like, if you want, like you can access this as a support. I know Crystal Palace were popularised recently because they offered that dedicated aftercare structure. My concern then is like how many players actively engage in that. For instance, if you're saying no, you're no longer good enough to be in this team, but also you can come back and we'll support you. As a player, do I want to go back to that environment that I've spent so many years in? Again, it depends on the individual, I suppose. So it's difficult to really generalise that. But that's my concern there, is that as a club, do you not then have a duty of care to follow that up and provide some sort of aftercare support? It's like, for instance, like I ruptured my ACL in 2019. I had an operation. Part of that aftercare support was that I was then given a dedicated physio, like 6 weeks.
Yeah.
That was only once a week for 6 weeks, but that was part of that aftercare program for that physical injury. So it's like we've heard stories before of like players, for instance, like the contracts have run out, but then they've suffered an injury, they've broken the leg, or they've suffered an ACL rupture or something, and then the club have said, no, we'll continue your rehab for like the next 6 months, for instance, because we're looking after you. But then I'm like, well, okay, from a mental health perspective, if you've basically said to someone like your livelihood is now gone, like the thing that you've dedicated to yourself to for potentially the last 10 years is no longer something we're interested in, what kind of emotional, psychological impact is that having on someone? Is there not some sort of duty of care there whereby you then should provide a sense of aftercare support? And as I said, it obviously it's going to come down to accessibility and financing, as everything does, because it's a business, and it makes me sad to say that, it really does. But you're supporting these players, and I remember a few months ago I was having a debate with a couple of other practitioners, and one of the lads was saying he was having this exact situation. Is that he knew this player was released. He was getting released, and he knew I couldn't tell him that I know you're being released. So straight away that causes an ethical dilemma, because you're like, I know you're being released. There's nothing I can do about it. It's nothing to do with me as a sports psych, but I can only support you as best I can. And then he does get released, and then you're like, well, I've spent the last few months working with this lad.
Yeah.
Like, I know what will be going through his head because it's stuff we've talked about, but now I can't support him.
Mm-hmm.
Or I then put the pressure on myself as a practitioner to go, okay, I can go out my way, and then I can end up like arranging something in an evening, but then am I being paid for that?
Yeah.
Am I being supported for that? Or is that something I'm just doing independently and then putting pressure on my own self as a practitioner, which then creates its own emotional stress?
Yeah.
Because then I'm tied to individuals are being released.
Yeah.
So again, it causes this huge, as I said earlier, this huge ethical / moral dilemma whereby, as practitioners, we're supporting players, but we're being paid to support them in-house.
Yeah.
So as soon as they're released, can we extend that remit?
Yeah.
To preventally, like, I don't know. It's like even as something as simple as like that aftercare program could be, right, these 5 players now are entitled to 6 one-to-ones online in the next 12 months, or in the next 6 months. They're entitled to at least 6 one-to-ones. The club will pay for, like, the club will support that. You'll be paid for that work, for instance. So we extend that. It's like, that's a very simple design on aftercare, Al.
Yeah.
Isn't it? But it's aftercare. It provides something.
Yeah, we've seen it, TV. Like a lot of some students do dissertations in this space, and there seems to be some sort of breakdown of like someone's not telling the truth here. Like the club will say they've got A, B, C, D, all the support, and then you speak to players who've been deselected. It's like, oh, they didn't say that to me, or I've got forgotten about. And there seems to be a bit of a sort of a communication breakdown there when they're collecting data around stuff like that. So I don't know what's going on there.
Yeah. I mean, we've encountered it before. Like we've had conversations before with like players who've been in the Premier League, for instance, and we've asked them like, that exact topic. Like, because we know like the PFA offers stuff.
Yeah.
I remember a few years ago, I was having a conversation with a player, and he was like, "Yeah, they're great on providing opportunities for like work, education, and funding that." But he said, "Me being able to access support," I said, "I was like the back of the queue. It was like the queue was extensive,
Yeah.
but I couldn't get into it." And it's the same here for like these young academy players. It's like we know the support's there, but how far does it extend? And how far are the club willing to support? And it's like you said, how like something's not lining up.
Yeah.
Like Party A are saying something, like, yeah, we do offer all this, but then the players are saying, well, I wasn't aware of it.
Yeah.
So is it even as simple as something like it's a signposting issue? Like, how aware are players of what's available?
Yeah.
And if it isn't available, just be honest about it. It's like we as a club can't finance that because we don't have the capacity. Well, okay, at least you're honest about it. So why don't you have the capacity? Well, we're a Cat 3 Academy and we don't have the funds available to support someone in an aftercare programme. Great, thank you for being honest about it. Again, ties back to the disparity issue that we talked about earlier. But then for a Cat 1 Academy, if you're saying to me, okay, this player's been released at 17 and he's been here since he was 9, have you got aftercare programmes available? Oh, no. Why? He's not our player. He's not our player anymore.
Yeah. It's an interesting conversation, Tom, and I'd like to try and get it a little bit better. I know, like you said, Palace have tried to put something in place, haven't they? But again, it'd be interesting just to speak to some of the players who've been through that experience, just to capture, what they think about it and what the strengths, what the limitations of it, and things like that. And so.
Oh, it's hugely commendable. Like I love that when I saw that story come out about that a few years ago, when they were saying, like the sort of country's first dedicated aftercare program. I was like, that's fantastic. Like, that's such an incredible initiative, and I think really encouraging, as well as a player, to know that's available, even if you don't engage with it, to be able to know, like, you're abundantly aware that that's available, which is reassuring in itself to know, right, if I do need that support in some capacity, it's there. If I don't, that's fine, because not all players do. Like, some players are better at adjusting than others. And find different opportunities. But for those who are struggling, for those individuals who are struggling, to be coming out of clubs in some cases and going, like, I need that support, to then go, good luck with that. It's like, do you not want to support me because I've been playing for years, for like the last 10 years? Well, you're not playing for us now. All right, sound.
No, it's brutal, Tom. And the way it is top level sport, you said ruthless earlier on, didn't you? It is. It's a ruthless environment, but there's lots of good in there as well, tucked away, and there's like balance to it. For the very lucky players, you can get right to the top, very lucrative, a lot of extrinsic rewards, great lifestyle, but unfortunately, it's the 99% we need to consider, isn't it? Who's chasing that dream and doesn't quite get there, unfortunately.
Yeah. But, I think like you've hit the nail on the head, Al, because there's often like a lot of negative discourse around academies. Like, are they doing enough? Are they doing this? I'm like, at Cat 1 Academies, guys, they're doing a lot.
Yeah.
There is a lot. Like, some of these players can't want for anything. It's like if you thinking about the 0.1% margin, these clubs are thinking about that because they want to support their players to the absolute best that they possibly can to potentially turn them into elite players. So there's an investment worth being made because they've got the money to do so. So the very top level support is incredible. So we can't diminish that. We can't sort of criticize that. But what we can do is maybe have a broader look at the wider scope of support across the entire pyramid structure from Premier League to League Two, and look at these categories of academies and go, what's actually being done to support these players? And how are we helping them? Back to your original question around flourishing. Like, how do we get them to flourish in a challenging environment that statistically, not all of them are going to make it. The majority, in fact, aren't going to make it. But how do we get them to maximise this opportunity to the point whereby coming out of this system, at whatever age that may be, gives them the best possible foundation to then excel in whatever else they want to do.
Yeah, 100%.
Is that being done?
Yeah. So I think that thanks. Just going to say thanks, Tom. Thanks for your insight and your wisdom and your knowledge and your experience. It's been a brilliant conversation. Some fantastic insight there in relation to the journey of young players coming through academies and the support, psychological support, mental health support that is on offer, is not on offer, that could be bettered, etc., etc. I think we could talk all afternoon about it, but it's been an absolute joy to have you on, Tom. And it's great to see you. It's great to see you passing your knowledge on in this space as well, and getting into clubs and working with young footballers, working with pro footballers. It's so important, isn't it? Because you're right, Tom. It is. But we go back just to finish that Shankly quote. It's a matter of life and death, or it's more important than that. You are talking sometimes psychologically the impact it can have on people. It could be a life or death situation because of the massive traumatic experience that they had if they've been deselected or injured, or it can be huge, and that support's massive, isn't it?
It is, Al. Yeah, absolutely spot on. Great way to end it, I think. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Tom, and I'll catch up with you soon.
Yeah. Cheers, Al. Thank you.